The morning sun barely peeked through the courthouse's towering windows as Sarah Williams rushed through the security checkpoint, her hospital ID badge swinging wildly from her neck. Her blue scrubs were wrinkled from the 12-hour night shift she had just finished at Children's Hope Hospital, and the smell of hospital-grade disinfectant still clung to her skin. "Courtroom 304, the security guard called out, noticing her anxious glances at the building directory. "Down the hall, take a right." Sarah's tennis shoes squeaked against the polished floor as she hurried toward her destination. In her hands, she clutched a manila envelope containing carefully organized documents, hospital shift schedules, emergency call logs, and parking receipts from the past 3 months. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Another message from the pediatric ward about 7-year-old Jamie's improving condition after last night's crisis. Inside courtroom 304, Judge Michael Harrison sat straight-backed in his high-backed leather chair, his reading glasses perched precisely on the bridge of his nose. 23 years on the bench had earned him a reputation for unwavering adherence to protocol. His morning docket typically consisted of traffic violations and minor infractions, the mundane machinery of justice that kept the city's legal system running. Case number 47,892. Sarah Williams. Multiple parking violations, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the half-empty courtroom. Sarah approached the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her envelope. "Your Honor, I can explain these tickets," she began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I'm a pediatric nurse at Children's Hope. These violations occurred during emergency calls when—" "Ms. Williams," Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar explanations he'd heard before. "The court has record of 6 parking violations in restricted zones between March and May. Each ticket clearly states the violation and the fine amount." "Yes, sir, I understand, but during emergency situations, the staff parking lot fills quickly, and sometimes we have no choice but to." Judge Harrison raised his hand, silencing her mid-sentence. He glanced at the documents before him, his expression unchanged. "Ms. Williams, this court sees hundreds of parking violations each month. Everyone has a story, everyone has a reason. The law exists to maintain order, not to accommodate individual circumstances." Sarah took a deep breath, pulling out her hospital emergency log. "Your Honor, if you could just look at these records. Last night alone, we had a 7-year-old boy." "Ms. Williams," the judge's tone grew firmer. "The question before this court is simple. Did you or did you not park in clearly marked restricted zones on 6 separate occasions?" The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah's shoulders slumped slightly. "Yes, Your Honor, but—" "Then this court finds you in violation of City Ordinance 23.45, Section B. The total fine for 6 violations amounts to $900, payable within 30 days. Judge Harrison's gavel struck with swift finality. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, the amount echoing in her mind. That was half her monthly rent. Behind her, a young girl, perhaps the judge's daughter, slipped quietly into the back row of the courtroom, her school backpack clutched to her chest. "Next case," Judge Harrison called out, already reaching for the next file. As Sarah walked out of the courtroom, her phone buzzed again. A message from the hospital. "Jamie asked for you. He's feeling better. Thanks for staying late with him last night." She smiled despite her tears, knowing that somewhere in the city, a little boy was alive, because she'd been there when he needed her most. Parking ticket be damned. 2 weeks after Sarah's court appearance, Judge Harrison maintained his usual morning routine. The sun had barely risen when he laced up his running shoes, breathing in the crisp morning air. For 20 years, he'd run the same 5-mile route through Henderson Park. Pride himself on never missing a day, rain or shine. His daughter Emily often teased him about his stubborn dedication to routine. The familiar path wound past the duck pond, where early morning mist still clung to the water's surface. Harrison checked his watch. Right on schedule. His thoughts drifted to the day's docket, mentally preparing for another series of traffic violations and minor disputes. Lately, though, he'd noticed himself feeling unusually winded during these runs. The first warning sign came as he rounded the park's eastern corner. A wave of dizziness hit him, forcing him to slow his pace. "Just the weather," he muttered, wiping unusual amounts of sweat from his brow, despite the cool morning. He pushed forward, his breathing becoming increasingly labored. Then the world tilted sideways. Harrison found himself on his knees, the rough gravel of the running path biting into his palms. A young couple walking their dog rushed to his side. "Sir, should we call an ambulance?" "I'm fine," he insisted, attempting to stand. His legs betrayed him, buckling beneath his weight. The last thing he heard was the woman's voice urgently speaking into her phone. "Yes, emergency. In Henderson Park, near the east entrance." He awoke to the steady beep of hospital monitors and Emily's worried face. At 16, she'd already mastered their mother's concerned expression, the one Angela had worn during countless late nights at the courthouse before cancer took her 3 years ago. "Dad?" Emily's voice quivered. "The doctors want to talk to you." Dr. Chen entered, carrying a tablet filled with test results. Harrison recognized the grave expression. He'd seen it too many times in his courtroom when experts delivered difficult testimony. "Judge Harrison," Dr. Chen began, pulling up a chair, "your blood work shows severe abnormalities. After running several tests, we've confirmed that you're suffering from a rare form of leukemia affecting your bone marrow." The words hit harder than any contempt charge he'd ever issued. Emily's hand gripped his tightly as Dr. Chen continued explaining treatment options, survival rates, and the urgent need for a bone marrow transplant. "Given the specific genetic markers we're seeing, finding a match won't be easy," Dr. Chen explained, her eyes moving between father and daughter. "We'll start searching the National Registry immediately, but I need to be honest, the window for successful treatment is limited." Emily's voice broke the heavy silence that followed. "What about me? Can I be tested?" Dr. Chen smiled gently. "We'll test you, of course, but siblings typically offer the best chance for a match, and since you're his daughter." Harrison watched his daughter's face crumple slightly, remembering how alone they'd both felt since Angela's passing. Now life was asking them to face another impossible battle. "How long?" he managed to ask. "Without a matching donor?" 6 months, maybe less." Dr. Chen's words hung in the air like a gavel's echo. "We'll start you on temporary treatments tomorrow, but our primary focus will be finding a donor match." That night, lying in his hospital bed, Harrison thought about all the lives he'd impacted from his bench, all the judgments he'd passed with unwavering certainty. Now his own fate rested in the hands of a stranger, someone who might show more mercy than he'd often demonstrated. 3 months into Judge Harrison's treatment, the hospital room had become a second home. Emily had decorated one wall with her father's law degree and a few family photos, trying to bring warmth to the sterile space. The constant beeping of medical equipment had become their unwanted background music, marking time like a metronome of uncertainty. Dr. Chen's daily visits brought the same routine. Check vitals, review blood work, shake her head slightly at the numbers that refused to improve. The National Registry search had yielded dozens of potential matches, but each follow-up test ended in disappointment. Harrison's unique genetic markers made finding a perfect match nearly impossible. Emily spent her afternoons doing homework in the hospital room, pretending not to notice how her father's robes hung in the closet, growing dusty. The courthouse had granted him medical leave, but Harrison still insisted on reviewing case files from his bed, even as the treatments left him increasingly exhausted. "Dad, maybe you should rest," Emily suggested one afternoon, watching him squint at documents through tired eyes. "The justice system doesn't rest, sweetheart," he replied with a weak smile, though his hands trembled as he turned the pages. That evening, as sunset painted the hospital room in shades of orange, Dr. Chen burst through the door with uncharacteristic energy. Her tablet nearly fell from her hands as she rushed to Harrison's bedside. "We found one," she announced, her professional composure briefly cracking with excitement. "A perfect match, right here in our city." Emily dropped her physics textbook, jumping to her feet. Harrison tried to sit up straighter, his heart monitor betraying his surge of emotion. "The donor has an extraordinary genetic profile," Dr. Chen explained, scrolling through her data. "Their markers align perfectly with yours. It's literally a 1 in a million match. And there's more." She looked up, her eyes bright. "This person has been in our system for years, regularly donating blood and platelets. They're registered for multiple donation programs." "Have they agreed?" Harrison asked, barely daring to hope. "The transplant coordinator is contacting them now. Given their history of donations, we're optimistic." Dr. Chen allowed herself a small smile. "Their medical records show a pattern of extraordinary generosity. 6 blood donations in the past year alone, plus volunteer work at—" She caught herself, remembering donor privacy protocols. "Well, let's just say this person has a history of helping others." Emily grabbed her father's hand. For the first time in months, tears of joy rather than worry filled her eyes. "Can we meet them? To say thank you?" "That's up to the donor," Dr. Chen explained. "They have the right to remain anonymous. But first, let's focus on getting your father ready for the procedure. If the donor confirms, and I'm confident they will, we can schedule the transplant for next week." Harrison leaned back against his pillows, overwhelmed by the possibility of a future he'd started to doubt. Somewhere in the city, a stranger held the key to his survival. Someone whose generosity extended beyond a single donation. Someone who had made helping others a way of life. "Whoever they are," he whispered, "I hope they know what this means." Emily hugged him gently, mindful of the IV lines. Outside the window, the last rays of sunlight caught the courthouse dome in the distance, its golden surface glowing like a beacon of hope. For the first time since his diagnosis, Judge Michael Harrison allowed himself to imagine returning to his bench, seeing his daughter graduate, having a future to plan for. Sarah arrived at City Memorial Hospital at dawn, her heart racing despite her familiarity with medical procedures. The transplant coordinator had called her 3 days ago, explaining the urgency of the situation. She'd agreed immediately, remembering too many young patients who hadn't found their matches in time. The pre-donation screening room felt different from her usual workplace. Here, she was the patient, dressed in a thin hospital gown instead of her usual scrubs. Her fingers traced the consent forms she'd just signed, her mind drifting to the mounting bills on her kitchen table. The court fines had forced her to pick up extra shifts, yet she hadn't hesitated when the registry called. "Just a few more tests," Nurse Martinez explained, drawing blood samples. "You've done an amazing thing, coming in so quickly. Some donors take weeks to decide." Sarah smiled softly. "When you work in pediatrics, you learn that time matters. Every day can make a difference." The nurse nodded, labeling the vials. "The recipient's been waiting months. Their daughter practically lives at the hospital now, poor thing. Such a sweet girl, always bringing her homework, trying to keep her father's spirits up." Something about those words tugged at Sarah's memory. But before she could place it, Nurse Martinez was called away for a moment, leaving her patient file open on the counter. Sarah's eyes automatically fell on the paperwork, a habit from reading countless charts at work. Then she saw it. Recipient's name, Harrison, Michael J. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright. Images flashed through her mind. The courthouse, the stern face behind the bench, the young girl in the back row. The same girl who now sat by her father's hospital bed, probably clutching her homework just as she'd held her backpack that day. Sarah's hands began to tremble. 3 months of extra shifts, picking up overtime just to make rent after paying those fines. She'd had to cancel her nephew's birthday gift, explain to her sister why she couldn't help with the family reunion costs. One signature from Judge Harrison had sent ripples through her entire life. A memory surfaced. A 7-year-old patient, Marcus, receiving his transplant last year. Why would someone help me? He'd asked her. They don't even know me. Because kindness doesn't need a reason, she told him, believing it with all her heart. The transplant coordinator returned, carrying more forms. Any questions about the procedure, Ms. Williams? Sarah looked up, her voice barely a whisper. The recipient, will they know who I am? Only if you choose to share your identity. Some donors prefer to remain anonymous. The coordinator paused. Is everything all right? You look pale. Sarah thought of Judge Harrison's face when he dismissed her explanation, his unwillingness to even look at her documentation. Then she thought of his daughter, probably as scared as Marcus's parents had been, waiting for a miracle. I'm fine, she said finally, steadying her voice, and I'd prefer to remain anonymous. The coordinator nodded, making a note in the file. The procedure's scheduled for tomorrow morning. You should get some rest tonight. Rest. Sarah almost laughed. She knew sleep would be impossible. Tonight, she would lie awake remembering every patient she'd watched receive the gift of life, every family's tears of joy, every miracle she'd witnessed. And tomorrow, she would become part of someone else's miracle, even if that someone had shown her no mercy when she'd needed it most. Sarah's apartment felt unusually quiet that night. She sat by her window, watching the city lights flicker while her untouched dinner grew cold. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from her sister asking about the missed family reunion payment. She let it go unanswered, her mind replaying memories like scenes from an old film. Tommy's face appeared first, the brave 7-year-old who decorated his hospital room with superhero posters. During his darkest days of chemotherapy, he'd told her, "Heroes don't give up." Nurse Sarah. He'd waited 6 months for his match, never losing his smile. Now he was back in school, playing soccer, living the life his donor had made possible. Then came Maria, the teenager who'd written thank you letters to her anonymous donor every week for a year. How do you thank someone for giving you your life back? She'd asked Sarah one night during rounds. Sarah had watched Maria graduate last spring, her donor sitting anonymously somewhere in the audience, watching the life they'd helped save bloom. The memory shifted to Judge Harrison's daughter in the courthouse, clutching her backpack, watching her father with such admiration. Sarah stood up, walking to her dresser where the court fine notice lay beside her bills. $900. The numbers that had changed her entire summer forced her to explain to her nephew why she could only get him a card for his birthday. Her reflection in the mirror caught her attention. What would Mom say? She whispered to herself. Her mother, a hospice nurse for 30 years, had always told her that healing happened in 2 ways, through medicine and through mercy. Sometimes the hardest hearts need healing too, baby, she'd say. Sarah's phone lit up with a notification from the hospital's messaging system. A photo from the pediatric ward. Jamie, the little boy from her last night shift, sitting up in bed, smiling weakly, but holding a thumbs up. Below it, a message from his mother. He asked for his favorite nurse. Thank you for staying with us through the crisis. Tears welled in her eyes as she remembered that night, the parking ticket waiting on her windshield after her emergency shift. The same type of ticket that had brought her before Judge Harrison. She walked to her kitchen, pulling out the registry paperwork she'd received when she first signed up to be a donor 3 years ago. The words at the top caught her eye. Your decision to join the registry could save a life. A life. Not a judge, not the man who'd find her, but a human being. A father whose daughter waited anxiously by his bedside. Sarah thought about what she told her young patients about forgiveness, about how being kind when it's hardest makes us stronger, not weaker. She picked up her phone, finally replying to her sister. I'm sorry about the reunion. I have to do something important tomorrow. I'll explain everything soon. Outside her window, the lights of City Memorial Hospital glowed in the distance. Somewhere in that building, a girl was probably saying goodnight to her father, hoping tomorrow would bring the miracle they'd been waiting for. Sarah touched her hand to the window, her decision crystallizing like the stars emerging in the night sky. Heroes don't give up, she whispered, echoing Tommy's words. Tomorrow, She would be someone's hero, even if they never knew her name. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in courtrooms, but in quiet moments when we choose light over darkness, hope over hurt, healing over hardness of heart. The morning of the donation arrived with the first rays of sunlight painting the hospital walls in soft gold. Sarah had arrived earlier than necessary, sitting in the hospital's meditation garden, watching the sunrise. A gentle breeze rustled through the prayer flags hanging above the benches, their soft fluttering a reminder of all the hopes and wishes they carried. "Ms. Williams?" a gentle voice called. Nurse Chen, different from her usual colleagues in pediatrics, stood at the garden entrance. "We're ready for you." The preparation room was warmer than Sarah expected. As she changed into the hospital gown, her fingers traced the familiar fabric, though it felt strange being on this side of the medical procedure. A photo on the wall caught her eye. A college of thank you letters from transplant recipients. She wondered if Judge Harrison would ever write one. "The process will take about 4 to 5 hours," Dr. Martinez explained while preparing the collection site. "You might feel some discomfort, but I know the procedure." Sarah smiled softly. "I've held many patients' hands through it." The doctor paused, noting something in her file. "It says here you're a pediatric nurse. That explains your calmness. Still, it's different when you're the one in the chair." Sarah settled into the reclining chair, wincing slightly as the first needle was inserted. The machine beside her hummed to life, beginning its vital work. Through the window, she could see other parts of the hospital. Somewhere, Judge Harrison was probably being prepared for his part of the procedure. A young nurse entered, carrying warm blankets. "Would you like to watch a movie? We have tablets with streaming services." Actually, Sarah reached for her bag. "I brought something to write." The nurse helped position a small clipboard where she could reach it comfortably. Sarah had thought about these words all night, wanting them to be perfect. In her neat handwriting, she began. "Dear Judge Harrison, you don't know me as the person giving you these cells, and perhaps that's for the best. But I want you to know why I'm here today. Every day in my work, I see people facing impossible choices. I see families praying for miracles and strangers becoming heroes through simple acts of kindness. Today, I choose to be part of your miracle, not because you deserve it more or less than anyone else, but because every life has value beyond what we can see in a single moment or meeting. Your daughter deserves to have her father. The world needs people who can learn and grow, and perhaps see things differently when given a second chance. My only request is that you use this gift well. Look for the stories behind the faces you see. Remember that mercy, like medicine, has the power to heal not just one person, but to ripple out and touch countless lives. Be well. Your donor." Sarah folded the letter carefully, sealing it in an envelope before handing it to the nurse. "Could you make sure he gets this, after everything is done?" The nurse nodded, tucking it safely away. Through the window, the morning sun had fully risen, another day of possibilities beginning. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the gentle pull of the collection machine. In her mind, she saw Tommy's smile, Maria's graduation, Jamie's thumbs up. All the lives touched by similar acts of generosity. Someone's phone beeped in the distance, probably another bill reminder. But for now, none of that mattered. In this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. 1 month after the transplant, Judge Harrison sat in his follow-up appointment, color finally returning to his face. The letter from his anonymous donor had become worn at its edges from frequent reading, its words etched into his mind. Emily sat beside him, scrolling through college applications on her phone, something that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. "Your numbers are excellent," Dr. Chen announced, reviewing his latest test results. "The donor cells have integrated perfectly. It's quite remarkable, really. I've rarely seen such a strong positive response." Harrison nodded, his fingers unconsciously touching the spot where the cells had been introduced. "When can I thank them? I know they chose to remain anonymous, but surely now." Dr. Chen smiled diplomatically. As I've mentioned, that's entirely up to the donor. However, she was interrupted by a knock at the door. A new nurse entered, carrying fresh supplies. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, checking Harrison's IV site. "Oh, you're the judge. I just transferred from pediatrics. Sarah will be so happy to hear you're doing well." She was worried about the procedure. The room fell silent. Dr. Chen's eyes widened in alarm. "Sarah." Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. The nurse, realizing her mistake, froze. I shouldn't have." "Sarah Williams." Harrison pressed, memories flooding back. The parking tickets, the hospital documents she tried to show him, her pleading voice explaining about emergency shifts. Emily looked up from her phone, recognition dawning on her face. The nurse from court. "Dad, wasn't she the one?" "Whoa. Please excuse me," Dr. Chen interrupted, quickly ushering the flustered nurse out. But it was too late. The truth had escaped, like evidence accidentally revealed to a jury. Harrison leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. The words from the letter took on new meaning. "Every life has value beyond what we can see in a single moment or meeting." "Dad?" Emily touched his arm. "Are you okay?" He reached for the letter with trembling hands, reading it again through new eyes. Each word now carried the weight of his own actions, his dismissal of her circumstances, his rigid adherence to rules over understanding. "She knew," he whispered. "She knew who I was, and still." His voice broke. Emily took the letter, reading it for the first time. "She's amazing," she said simply. After what happened in court, Harrison remembered his own words that day. The law exists to maintain order, not to accommodate individual circumstances. How wrong he had been. The law existed to serve justice, yes, but justice without mercy was like a hospital without healing. All structure, no heart. "Can we find her?" Emily asked. "To thank her?" Harrison shook his head slowly. "She chose to remain anonymous. That was her last kindness, giving me the gift without the burden of gratitude." He touched the letter again. "But she's right. The only way to truly thank her is to use this gift well." Dr. Chen returned, apologetic about the breach of confidentiality. But Harrison barely heard her. In his mind, he was back in his courtroom, seeing for the first time what he'd missed before. The stories behind each face, the circumstances behind each case, the humanity behind each law. "When can I return to work?" he asked suddenly. Dr. Chen blinked, surprised. "Well, at this rate, perhaps in 2 weeks, but—" "Good," Harrison nodded, his voice firm but gentle, like the letter writer's. "I have some changes to make." 6 months later, Sarah hurried through the hospital corridors during her night shift, responding to a call from the emergency department. A young mother stood there, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a handful of parking tickets. "I'm sorry," the mother stammered. "My son's asthma. I couldn't find parking during his attacks, and now these fines." She held out the citations with trembling hands. Sarah's heart clenched, remembering her own similar struggles. But before she could speak, a nurse handed her an envelope. "This came for you from the courthouse." Inside, she found her original parking fines, stamped RisingAboveFear in bold red letters. Attached was a notice about a new program, Hospital District Parking Relief Initiative. The document outlined provisions for emergency medical parking situations, with a familiar name at the bottom: Judge Michael Harrison. Across town, Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing cases differently than he had 6 months ago. Each file now represented a story to him, a life touched by circumstances that couldn't always be measured by strict legal standards. On his desk stood a small frame containing the words from Sarah's letter: "Every life has value beyond what we can see." Emily, home from her first semester at college, knocked on his chamber door. "Dad? They're ready for you in the conference room." Harrison straightened his robes and followed his daughter. The room was filled with local press, hospital administrators, and city officials. As he approached the podium, He saw familiar faces from the hospital, doctors, nurses, and even a few patients. His eyes scanned the crowd, always hoping to glimpse the one face he'd never properly thanked. "Today," he began, his voice strong and clear, "we're expanding the hospital district parking relief initiative to all medical facilities in our jurisdiction. But this program represents more than just parking solutions. It represents our commitment to understanding that justice and mercy are not opposing forces. They're two sides of the same coin." In the pediatric ward, Sarah watched the press conference on a small break room TV, cradling a sleeping patient in her arms. The young boy had just received his own bone marrow transplant, his anonymous donor cells now flowing through his veins, writing a new story of hope. Her phone buzzed with a text from the billing department. All her remaining court fines had been anonymously paid, with a donation made in her name to the hospital's staff parking program. She smiled, understanding the message behind the gesture. Back at the courthouse, Harrison concluded his speech. "Sometimes the greatest lessons come from those we've wronged, and the truest justice comes from those who choose to rise above their hurt to help others. Today, we're not just changing a policy, we're changing how we see each other." That evening, as Sarah left her shift, she found a fresh parking permit on her windshield, marked Emergency Medical Personnel, Priority Access. The permit number caught her eye. BMD 316. The date of her bone marrow donation. She looked up at the hospital windows, warm lights glowing against the darkening sky. Somewhere inside, parents sat with sick children, families waited for miracles, and countless stories of hope and healing unfolded. And in a courthouse across town, a changed man sat in his chambers, seeing each case that came before him through new eyes, eyes that had learned to look beyond the surface, beyond the rules, to the beating heart of justice itself. Sarah touched the permit and smiled. Some victories weren't marked by gavels or certificates, but by quiet acts of kindness that rippled outward, touching life after life, changing the world in ways that no law could measure.